When I first received the notes from Yating, I spent a long time just looking at her background. She's 29, she's a businesswoman here in Atlanta, and until 6 days ago, her entire world was built on things you can measure, things you can see on a balance sheet. She identifies as a deist, someone who believes there might be a creator, but one who stays at a distance, a hands-off architect. But what happened to her last week in a quiet office building doesn't fit that distant model. It's what we call a demographic surprise in our research. Usually, when we see accounts that are this specific about ancient biblical imagery, they come from people who have spent their lives in a pew. But Yating didn't. She spent her life in the network of modern achievement. When I sat with this story, I realized we were looking at something I call a network partition. Basically, what that means is that the connection between her physical self and her conscious self was suddenly cut, like a telephone line being severed by a falling branch during a Georgia thunderstorm. The operator is still at the desk, ready to talk, but the wires are gone. I want you to listen to how she describes the minutes leading up to it. There's a detail about the light in her office that I've heard in other accounts from people who work in high-pressure environments. It's a specific kind of visual ghosting that suggests the mind is already starting to reach for a different frequency before the body even knows it's failing. Here's how Ying describes it, in her own words. It was late. I don't know the exact time, but the cleaning crews had already finished my floor. The office was that kind of quiet, where you can hear the hum of the air conditioning behind the walls, and the smell of that burnt, 3-hour-old coffee was still hanging in the break room air. I was looking at a spreadsheet. The numbers were just rows of black ink on a bright white background, but the blue light from my monitor, you know that specific cold glow, it was reflecting off my glasses. That's the last thing I remember clearly. The blue light. I didn't feel sick, I wasn't tired, not more than usual. But I remember looking at the screen and thinking that the numbers were starting to move. They weren't just staying in their cells, they were drifting. I blinked, thinking my eyes were just strained. But when I opened them, the office was gone. Actually, that's not true. I'm trying to be accurate here, but it's hard because the order of things feels like it's shifting in my head. Before the office was gone, there was this moment of absolute crushing weight in my chest. It felt like someone had stepped onto my ribs. I remember my hand reaching for the edge of the desk, but my fingers didn't feel like my fingers. They felt like they were made of cotton. I heard a sound, a soft thud. I think that was me hitting the carpet, but I didn't feel the impact. Then there was the void. It wasn't black. That's the first thing I told the doctors, and they looked at me like I was still oxygen deprived. It wasn't like being in a dark room. It was like being in a space where light hadn't been invented yet. It was empty, just complete, hollow emptiness. But here's the thing that haunts me. I could still see that blue rectangle, the ghost of my computer screen. It was just hanging there in the middle of nothing, a little glowing window to a world I wasn't in anymore. It felt like a tether, but it was fading. I watched it get smaller and smaller, like a television being turned off in a dark house. I was alone. And for a second I thought, this is it. This is the distant creator's waiting room. I felt a strange kind of logic in it. If God doesn't interfere, then death is just the end of the signal. But then the signal, he was changed. He was just there. I didn't see him walk up. I didn't see a flash of light. It was more like someone had turned a dial and suddenly he was in focus. It was Jesus. I say that now and it sounds so certain, but you have to understand, I didn't grow up going to Sunday school. I didn't have pictures of him on my walls. But the second I saw him, my brain it locked onto his identity. It was like recognizing a face you've known your entire life, but haven't seen since you were a child. There was no question. His presence was like a physical heat. Not a burning heat, but the kind of warmth you feel when you stand in the sun after being in a basement for too long. He looked at me, and I felt like every spreadsheet I'd ever worked on, every meeting I'd ever sat through, every plan I'd ever made for my career, it was all just static, noise. He said my name. Yating. The way he said it, it wasn't just a name. It was like he was acknowledging the very center of who I am. He told me he needed to show me something that most people refuse to believe. He said I was going back and that I had to tell people what I saw. I wanted to ask him why. Why me? I'm a businesswoman in Atlanta. I'm not a preacher. I don't even know if I believe in the version of him that people talk about on TV. But before I could even get the words out, and I'm not sure I even had a mouth to speak with, we were moving. Let me pause the story for a moment because I need to stop here and look at something Yating just described. From everything I've learned, listening to accounts like this, the blue light detail is a major pattern match. In our research, we track what we call signal integrity. Think of it like a radio that's losing its station. Right before the music cuts out completely, you might hear a bit of the next station bleeding through. Yating's computer monitor wasn't just a physical object anymore. It became a visual anchor. It's what her consciousness held onto as the network partition happened. When I sit with this part of the story, I'm struck by the latency she describes. In technical terms, latency is the delay between a command and a response. She felt the weight in her chest, but she didn't feel the floor. Her mind was already operating on a different connection layer. I've seen this in dozens of other submissions from professionals, surgeons, pilots, architects. They often describe a lingering object from their work environment that follows them into the vision. It's as if the brain is trying to bridge the gap between the world of logic and the world of the spirit. But notice what happens when Jesus appears. The static of her life, her career, her plans, it all falls away. In the Gamma framework, we look at this as the restoration of the primary connection. If we think of our lives as a complex network of wires and cables, this moment is like plugging the main power source back in. The peripheral stuff doesn't matter anymore because the core signal is finally clear. I have to be honest, this part of her account makes me a little uncomfortable as a researcher. I like things that I can categorize neatly. But Yating's reaction to seeing a figure she didn't technically believe in is a detail that repeats across independent accounts from all over the world. It's a pattern that breaks my own frameworks, and that's usually when I know we're touching something real. Listen to what happened next as the movement began. We weren't walking. I keep trying to find the right word for it, but there isn't one in English or Mandarin that fits. It was like the distance between 2 points just disappeared. 1 second we were in that void, and the next, the texture of the air changed. It wasn't air though. It was heavy. It felt like trying to breathe under a thick quilt. Jesus began to speak to me while we moved. He didn't look at me every time he spoke. He looked ahead, like a guide leading someone through a dangerous pass in the mountains. He told me that when he walked the earth, he talked about hell more than he talked about heaven. I remember thinking, wait, is this the part where I get judged? I felt this spike of panic, like I'd missed a deadline I didn't know existed. I thought about all the times I'd been fine or good enough, but had never really looked for him. He seemed to hear that thought without me saying it. He told me that he spoke about it because he saw something devastating, something eternally catastrophic. Those were the words that stuck in my mind. Eternally catastrophic. It sounded so final, so permanent. He told me that every single day, thousands and thousands of people die. He used a number, but in that place, numbers didn't feel the same way they do on my spreadsheets. They felt like lives, like heartbeats. And he said the majority of them were heading to a place of unimaginable torment. The majority. That hit me like a physical blow. I thought about my office building. I thought about the people I see in the elevators every morning, the people I pass on Peachtree Street. Most of them. Then he stopped. We were standing, or hovering, I don't know, over what looked like a massive pit. But pit is too small a word. It was a landscape of descent. The sounds, that was the first thing that broke me. I've lived in cities my whole life. I'm used to the sound of traffic, of sirens, of thousands of people moving at once. But this was different. This was what I can only call a symphony of anguish. It wasn't just screaming. It was the sound of millions of people realizing at the exact same time that they had lost everything. It was a collective weeping that had a physical weight to it. It pressed against my skin. It made my soul want to just curl up and disappear. Jesus looked down at it, and I've never seen a face with that much sorrow. He told me, many of those heading there once sat in churches. They heard about me, but they never truly accepted me as their Lord. They thought knowing about me was enough. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I thought about all the things I knew about religion. I knew the stories. I knew the holidays. I thought that was the same thing as being connected to the source. But looking at that pit, I realized that knowing about someone is like having a telephone but never actually dialing the number. The equipment is there, but the connection isn't. Suddenly, we were closer. We were moving down into the atmosphere of that place. And the heat, it wasn't like a summer day in Georgia. It was a supernatural heat. It didn't just burn your skin, it burned your memory. He pointed to a figure below us, a man. I could see him clearly, even though there was no sun. He was in absolute agony. I watched him, and it was like watching a recording of someone's worst moment played on a loop that never ends. Jesus said, "Do you see that man? That is the rich man from the story I told." He mentioned Luke 16. I remembered the name Lazarus from somewhere in the back of my mind, but I'd always thought it was just a story, a metaphor, a way to tell people to be nice to the poor. But Jesus looked at me and said, "This isn't a parable, Yating. This is real. Watch and listen." The man was screaming. He was in flames, but he wasn't being consumed. He wasn't turning to ash. He was just staying in the pain. He cried out, "I am tormented in this flame." And then Jesus told me something that I still can't get out of my head. He used a word, basanizo. He said it meant to torture, to vex with grievous pains. He explained it like he was teaching a student, but the subject was horror. He said it was the most severe form of physical and mental anguish possible. I watched this man beg. He wasn't begging for a way out. He wasn't begging for his life back. He was begging for a drop of water. Just one drop. He wanted Lazarus, the man he'd ignored his whole life, to just dip the tip of his finger in water and cool his tongue. That was the scale of the desperation. A single drop for a moment of relief, and the answer was no. I saw a figure in the distance, someone Jesus called Abraham, and he explained that there was a great gulf fixed between where they were and where the man was, a gulf that no one could cross. Jesus turned to me, and his eyes were so intense I had to look away. He asked me if I understood what that meant. "It's not just the physical torment, Yating," he said. "It's the complete and eternal hopelessness." He told me that in life, no matter how bad things get, there's always a tomorrow. There's always the possibility that the weather will change, or the pain will fade, or a friend will call. There's always a thread of hope you can hang on to. But in this place, there is no tomorrow. There isn't even time. It's just an eternal now of regret. I thought about my life back in Atlanta. I thought about how I always say, "I'll do it tomorrow. I'll call my parents tomorrow. I'll think about spiritual things tomorrow. I'll deal with my stress tomorrow." I looked back at the man in the pit, and I realized that tomorrow is a gift that eventually runs out. We moved again, deeper into the dark, but the darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things I didn't want to see. I want to pause for a moment here, because this is where the meaning reveals itself in a very specific way. In the Gamma framework, we talk about network partitioning, which is when a system is split into two or more parts that can no longer communicate with each other. This is exactly what Yating is describing with this great gulf. Imagine a family table. For years, everyone sits there, they pass the salt, they share stories, they're connected. Then a wall is built, not just a wall of wood, but a wall of silence. You can see them on the other side, you can hear their voices, but you can never, ever sit at that table again. That is the relational severing she's talking about. When Jesus tells her this isn't a parable, he's shifting the data from symbolic to literal. For a researcher, this is a critical moment. If the experience was just a hallucination based on her own mind, why would a deist who doesn't read the Bible see a specific scene from the Gospel of Luke? I've heard this symphony of anguish described in other accounts too. One woman from South Carolina called it the hum of the lost. It's a collective sound, which suggests that even in a place of isolation, there is a horrific kind of shared network of pain. But notice the drop of water detail. In our world, a drop of water is nothing. We waste gallons of it every time we brush our teeth. But in a state of total disconnection from the source, from the water of life, the value of a single drop becomes infinite. It reminds me of an old well in my grandmother's garden. When the well was full, we didn't think about it. But during the droughts, when the bucket came up dry, you realize that every bit of moisture was a miracle. Yating is seeing the absolute drought of the soul. She mentioned that the heat burned her memory. This is an incredible observation. It suggests that the torment isn't just external. It's an internal feedback loop where your own memories of the life you wasted become the fuel for the fire. She remembered this part with such vivid detail, even though she wanted to forget. The darkness changed again. Jesus referenced a verse, Matthew 8:12, about outer darkness. I used to think darkness was just the absence of light, but this was something else. This was a darkness that had substance. It felt like walking through thick, cold oil. It pressed against my eyes, my skin, my chest. It felt like it was trying to get inside me. And yet, somehow, I could still see the flames. It didn't make sense. How can there be fire and total darkness at the same time? But I saw it. The flames didn't give off light. They didn't illuminate the space around them. They were just heat and pain that you could perceive even when you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Jesus explained that this darkness can be felt. He said it presses against the soul. And then I heard it again, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. But it wasn't just crying. It was the sound of rage. It was the sound of someone who has lost a game they didn't realize they were playing until it was over. It was the sound of absolute biting frustration. I remember thinking about a time I lost a major contract at work because of a tiny mistake I made. I spent weeks grinding my teeth, replaying that mistake in my head, wishing I could go back and change just one sentence. Now, imagine that feeling, but amplified by a billion. And imagine knowing that you can never, ever fix it. That's what the gnashing of teeth felt like. It was the sound of eternal regret. Then Jesus showed me the worms. I want to stop here. I don't want to describe this, but he told me I had to. He quoted Mark 9:48, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. I saw them. They weren't like the earthworms you see after a rainstorm in Atlanta. They were like maggots, but they were huge, and they were feeding on things that looked like decaying flesh. But the flesh wasn't disappearing. It was in a constant state of rot, but it never turned to nothing. The worms never died. They never stopped eating. Jesus said, in hell, people experience a constant state of decay and corruption, being eaten alive by worms that never die while being burned by fire that never goes out. I started shaking. I'm a rational person. I believe in science. I believe in progress. But looking at those things, I realized that my rationality was just a thin blanket I'd been using to hide from a very cold reality. I looked at Jesus, and I think I was crying, even though I didn't have a body to cry with. I asked him, how can this be? How can there be a place like this? He didn't answer with a philosophical explanation. He took me to a different place. It was a gate. It was massive, wide, broad. And there were people, so many people walking through it. It looked like the airport during the holidays, just a constant flowing stream of humanity moving in one direction. Jesus said, the majority of humanity is heading to this place. The gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many go through it. He told me that many means the greater number, the majority. And then I saw them. I recognized people. I saw a neighbor from my apartment complex, someone I used to see at the gym. I saw a man I'd worked with 2 years ago. I even saw people I knew went to church every Sunday. They were all walking through that gate with this blank, hollow look on their faces, like they were in a trance. Jesus saw my shock. Most people, he said, not just the really bad ones, but most people are on the path to hell right now. There are people in your family, Yating, people in your office, your neighborhood, and most of them have no idea what's waiting for them. I thought about my coworkers. I thought about the guy who sits in the cubicle next to mine, the one who always shares his snacks. I thought about my manager. Are they all on this path? The urgency of it hit me then. It wasn't just a testimony anymore. It was an alarm. I realized that if I didn't go back, if I didn't tell them, then their connection to the world of the living was just a countdown to this. I want to pause for a moment here because something in her telling really struck me. When Yating describes the outer darkness as something that presses against the soul, She's describing a total sensory blackout. In the Gamma framework, we call this a network blackout. It's when every single outgoing and incoming port is closed. Think about how it feels when your power goes out at night. For the first few minutes, it's almost peaceful. But then, you realize you can't see anything. You can't check the news. You can't call for help. You are completely isolated in your own home. Now, imagine that isolation lasting forever. The gnashing of teeth as a physical response to lost opportunity is a very modern way of understanding an ancient concept. In our research, we see this a lot with high achievers. Their greatest fear isn't just pain, it's the realization that they failed at the one thing that actually mattered. And then there's the detail about recognizing people. This is the part that often causes the most debate in the comments. People ask, how could a loving God let neighbors and coworkers go there? But if we look at it through the lens of relationship, it starts to make sense. If a person chooses to live their life disconnected from the source, God respects that choice. He doesn't force the connection. But the wide gate being like an airport at the holidays, that's a sensory break that I've only heard from people who live in major hubs like Atlanta. It shows how our own experiences shape how we perceive these universal truths. Yating is seeing the default path. In a world of networks, if you don't actively join the secure connection, you're left on the open, broad network that leads to nowhere. We're going to stop here for today. In the next part, Yating is going to describe the smell of this place, a detail that nearly made her lose her mind, and the conversation she had with Jesus about why this place was built in the first place. It's a detail that changes everything we think we know about why hell exists. In our research, we look at something called the connection layer. Think of it like a family recipe that's been passed down for 4 generations. Even if the original cook is gone and the kitchen has been remodeled and the handwriting on the card has faded, the information, the way those ingredients work together, it persists. It stays in the network of the family. Yating's experience at the wide gate suggests that our relational nodes, the people we recognize, the coworkers we see every day, are part of a data stream that continues even after the network partition happens. She saw people she knew. She saw the familiar in a place that was terrifyingly unfamiliar. But as she moves deeper into this vision, we see the dark side of that connectivity. We see what happens when the signal you're receiving isn't love or light, but a collective frequency of regret. I want to look closely at what she calls the symphony of anguish. It's a detail that provides a massive amount of data for our pattern tracking, especially when we compare it to accounts from very different cultural backgrounds. Listen to what happened next, in her own words, as the transit continued. I'm trying to remember if we walked or if the ground just moved under us. I think it was the latter. It's like when you're standing on one of those moving walkways at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. You're stationary, but you're being pulled toward a destination you didn't choose. The air was getting heavier. I keep thinking of it like a thick wool quilt that's been soaked in water. It was hard to move through. It had a texture to it, like there were particles of grief suspended in the atmosphere. Jesus was still beside me. His presence was the only thing that felt solid. Everything else, the walls of the pit, the shadows moving in the distance, it all felt like it was vibrating with this low-frequency hum. Then the hum changed. We reached a ledge, and I looked down. I've lived in Atlanta my whole life, so I know what a crowd sounds like. I've been to stadiums, I've been in the middle of protests, but this wasn't a crowd. It was a sea. The sound coming from that pit, it wasn't just noise. It was a symphony of anguish. Imagine if every person who ever lost a child, every person who ever realized they'd made a mistake they could never fix, every person who ever died in total loneliness. Imagine if they all cried out at the exact same second. And then imagine that sound never stopping. It had a physical weight. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it hard to think. It was a sound that told you, in no uncertain terms, that there is no hope here. It was the sound of a network that has been permanently severed from its power source, and all that's left is the static of the breakdown. Jesus didn't look away from it. He looked right into the middle of that sound. He called me by my name. Yat Ting, he said, and his voice felt like it was vibrating through the very center of my being. But at the same time, it felt like he was speaking to everyone who would ever hear this. He said, "Yating, I talked about hell more than heaven because I saw this. I saw this devastating end." He pointed to a specific area below us. It was a man. He was alone, but he was surrounded by millions. That's the thing about this place. You are in a crowd, but you are in total, absolute isolation. It's like being in a city where no one speaks your language and no one can see your face. Jesus said, "Do you see that man there? That's the rich man from the story I told in Luke 16. I remember thinking, why is he telling me a Bible story? I'm a businesswoman. Give me facts. But then I saw the man's face. He was in absolute agony. There were flames, not orange and yellow like a campfire, but a deep, dark red that seemed to swallow the light. They were consuming him, but he wasn't turning into ash. He was just staying in the fire. He was screaming, "I am tormented in this flame." Jesus turned to me. He looked older then, or maybe just heavier with the weight of what we were seeing. He used a word, basanizo. He said, "In the language they use to write my stories, this word means to torture, to vex with grievous pains, to torment." He explained it like he was a professor, but his voice was shaking with this deep, resonant sadness. He said it's the word used for the most severe forms of physical and mental anguish. It's the kind of pain that doesn't just hurt, it occupies your entire existence. There is no room for anything else. I watched this man reach out. He was looking towards something in the distance, something I could barely see, like a faint glow on the horizon. He was begging a man named Abraham to send someone named Lazarus to dip his finger in water. Just a drop. I've never seen a human being want something so badly. In my world, we want promotions, we want cars, we want the latest phone. This man just wanted a single molecule of moisture to touch his tongue for 1 second. And the answer was no. I heard Abraham's voice. It didn't sound mean. It sounded logical, like a law of physics. He said there's a great gulf fixed. No one can cross over. Jesus looked at me and asked, "Do you understand what this means, Yating?" I told him I didn't. I didn't understand how a drop of water could be too much to ask. He said, "It's not just the physical torment. It's the complete and eternal hopelessness. In your life, no matter how bad a quarter goes, no matter how much you lose in the market, you always think that tomorrow might be better. You have a concept of tomorrow. In hell, there is no tomorrow. There isn't even time as you know it." I thought about my watch. I thought about the deadlines I have on my calendar. The idea of no tomorrow felt like a vacuum. It was like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. If there's no tomorrow, then the pain you're feeling right now is the only thing that will ever exist. Forever. We moved to another area. The sound of the symphony of anguish got louder. It was starting to sound like words now. Millions of voices saying the same thing. Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I choose? Let me show you what I'm noticing here, because this detail about the symphony is something that keeps coming up in our research. When I sit with this story, I'm struck by how Yating, a young modern woman, describes a sound that she calls a symphony of anguish. In our pattern documentation, we've seen this before. We had a submission 3 years ago from an older man in rural South Carolina who called it the hum of the lost. He described it as the sound of 1,000 broken radios, all stuck on the same static frequency. This is the connection layer at its most dysfunctional. In a healthy network, information flows back and forth. You give, you receive, you grow. But in this place, Yating is describing, the signal is a one-way street of regret. Everyone is broadcasting their own pain, and everyone is receiving everyone else's. Think of it like a party where everyone is talking and no one is listening. After a while, the noise becomes a physical weight. It's not communication anymore, it's just a burden. And then there's the word Jesus uses, basanizo. I want to speak to those of you who have lived long enough to understand what grievous pain really feels like. Maybe it's a chronic illness, or the kind of grief that makes it hard to get out of bed in the morning. You know that pain isn't just a feeling, it's a state of being. It colors everything. Yating is seeing the relational partition, where the only thing left is the memory of what was lost. I'm struggling with the no tomorrow concept. As a researcher, I map things on timelines. But if you remove the timeline, If you remove the ability for a node to update its status, you're left with a permanent frozen error. Basically, what that means is that the network of that person's soul is stuck in a feedback loop. It's like a record player with a scratched disc playing the same second of a song over and over. The song never ends, and it never progresses. It just stays. He told her this part with more clarity than anything else, like he wanted to make sure she didn't miss a single note of that sound. We moved deeper into the pit. The temperature was rising, but it wasn't a dry heat like a desert. It was a humid, choking heat. It felt like standing too close to a massive engine that's about to explode. Jesus said something that made me stop and look at him. He said, in Matthew 8:12, I describe this as outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Suddenly, I was experiencing exactly what he meant. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a darkness that pressed in from every side, so complete that I couldn't see my own hands. I couldn't see Jesus anymore, but I could feel his presence, like a warm spot in a cold room. And then I heard the gnashing. It wasn't just a sound people make when they're cold. It was the sound of rage. It was the sound of people realizing they had the key to the door in their pocket the whole time, and they only realized it after the door was welded shut. Jesus explained, the weeping and gnashing isn't just crying, Yating. It's the sound of souls in absolute pain. It's the sound of someone who has lost everything and realizes they will never get it back. The gnashing of teeth represents rage, frustration, and the physical response to unbearable pain. I thought about all the times I'd been frustrated at work, all the times I'd ground my teeth because a project was late or a client was difficult. I felt this wave of shame. My problems were so small. My pain was so superficial. I asked him, why doesn't it stop? If they're sorry, why can't they come out? He didn't look at me. He just said, in hell, there are no second chances. He referenced Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. Then he showed me something that made me want to scream. I'm a city person. I don't like bugs. I don't like dirt. But he showed me the worms. He quoted Mark 9:43 and 48, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. I saw them. They weren't ordinary worms. They were like maggots, but they were feeding on what looked like decaying flesh. But the people weren't being destroyed. They were just decaying forever. Jesus said, people experience a constant state of decay and corruption, being eaten alive by worms that never die, while simultaneously being burned by fire that never goes out. The fire never stops burning, never runs out of fuel, never dims even for a moment. I felt this physical nausea. I wanted to close my eyes, but I didn't have eyes to close. I had to see it. I looked at the people, thousands of them, millions of them, and I realized they weren't just souls. They were people. They had names, they had families, they had jobs, and now they were just fuel for this. I thought about the majority again. Jesus took me to see a massive gate. It was wide and broad, and people were walking through it in a steady stream. Yating, he said. In Matthew 7:13-14, I told people that the majority of humanity is heading to this place. I said the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many go through it. The word many means the greater number. The majority. I watched a woman walk through. She looked like she could have been my mother's age. She was wearing a dress that looked normal, like she'd just come from the grocery store. She had this look of total, sudden realization on her face as she stepped through the gate. And then she was gone into the dark. Jesus saw me shaking. He said, most people, not just the really bad ones, but most people are on the path to hell right now. There are people in your family, Yating, people in your neighborhood, and most of them have no idea what's waiting for them. I thought about my parents. They're good people. They're kind. They worked hard to give me everything. But they don't think about Jesus. They think about him the way I did, as a distant figure in a book. Is that enough to end up here? The scale of it, it's what I can't get over. As a businesswoman, I think about market share. I think about percentages. If the majority is heading here, then the system of our world is failing on a level that I can't even comprehend. We moved again, and the smell hit me. From everything I've learned listening to accounts, the majority detail is the hardest one for people to hear. It's the one that causes the most resistance. But in the gamma framework, it's a matter of connectivity. If you have a massive network, let's say a city's power grid, and 90% of the houses are disconnected from the main plant, it doesn't matter how good the houses are. It doesn't matter if they have beautiful curtains or well-manicured lawns. If they aren't plugged in, they have no light. The wide gate is the default setting of a disconnected world. Yating is seeing the result of a relational partition on a global scale. I'm particularly struck by her observation of the woman in the dress. It's a sensory break that reminds us these aren't just statistics. These are lives. It's like seeing a single familiar face in a news report about a disaster halfway across the world. Suddenly, the disaster is real. And then there's the detail about the worms. In our world, decay is the end of a process. It's how nature recycles life. But Yating is describing a constant state of decay. Think of it as a computer program that's stuck in a deleting phase, but never actually reaches 100%. The data is being shredded bit by bit forever, but the file remains. This is the basanizo, the torment that occupies the entire existence. I have a question for you all, and I'm genuinely looking for data here. Yating is a young Chinese-American woman from an urban environment. Her symphony of anguish sounds like a city's noise, but I want to know if you've experienced something like this, or if you've heard accounts from rural or communal backgrounds. Does the sound change? Does a person from a small village hear a different kind of collective sound? Is the connection layer shaped by the culture we lived in? I suspect that the symphony is the universal sound of the disconnected, but the instruments might be different for everyone. We're going to stop here. In the next part, Yating is going to describe the smell of this place, the burning sulfur, and the moment she realized that hell wasn't actually built for us. It's the most heartbreaking part of her account, and it's the moment her deist logic finally crumbled. There's a detail here that keeps coming up in the comments of our other videos, and it's something Yating's account might finally help us map. Many of you have asked a very difficult question. If hell is a place of total darkness and isolation, how can people recognize each other there? It seems like a contradiction. If the connection is severed, shouldn't everyone be invisible to one another? When I was reviewing this account, I noticed that Yating describes what I call a protocol of separation. Basically, what that means is that while the network to God is cut, the relational data, the memories of who we knew in life, remains active, but it's twisted. It's like a telephone switchboard where all the lines are crossed. You can hear the voices of the people you knew. You might even see their faces through the ghosting of the darkness, but you can never actually reach them. You're close enough to feel the pain of their loss, but too far to offer a single word of comfort. In this part of the vision, Yating moves from the general many at the gate to specific faces from her life in Atlanta. It's a moment where her professional world and this ancient spiritual reality collide in a way that's almost too much for her to process. And then there's the smell. It's the one detail she said she could still taste days later. Listen to how she articulates this next part, especially the moment she saw a face she knew. The smell hit me before the heat did. I've spent a lot of time in downtown Atlanta. I know what a city smells like. Exhaust, hot asphalt, the occasional scent of trash on a humid day. But this was a concentrated version of something I'd only smelled once or twice, like a struck match. It was sulfur. Jesus referenced Revelation 19:20, explaining that this place burns with brimstone. I didn't know what brimstone was until he told me. It's sulfur, and when it burns, it produces this nauseating, choking odor that doesn't just fill your nose, it fills your entire being. It felt like I was swallowing thick, bitter smoke that never cleared. I was gasping or trying to, and that's when I saw the man. I shouldn't have been able to see him. It was so dark, and that ghostly blue rectangle from my computer screen was still flickering at the edge of my vision, making everything feel like a double exposure. But he was there, walking toward that massive wide gate. He was a coworker. I'm not going to use his name, but we'd worked on the same floor for 3 years. He was the kind of guy who always had a joke. He was successful, he was fine. I watched him step through the gate. He didn't look like he was being dragged. He looked like he was just following the path he'd been on his whole life. And then he looked up, and for one split second, I swear he saw me. The look of absolute, soul-deep shock on his face. It was like he just realized he'd boarded a plane for the wrong country, and the doors were already locked. I turned to Jesus. I think I was screaming, but my voice felt like it was being muffled by a heavy blanket. "He was a good guy," I said. "He was nice. Why is he here?" Jesus looked at me, and his expression was so serious it made the sulfur smell feel even heavier. He said, "Most people, Yating, not just the really bad ones, are on this path. They have no idea what's waiting for them because they think being nice is the same as being connected to me." Then he told me something that shattered my heart. He said, "Hell wasn't created for humans, Yating." I stopped. I didn't understand. If it wasn't for us, why were there millions of us there? He referenced Matthew 25:41. He said, "I told them, 'Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels.'" He explained that hell was designed for Satan and his demons. It was a place of punishment for beings who are far more evil than any human could comprehend. And when humans go there, they're entering a system that wasn't built for them. He said, "Think about how uncomfortable it feels to be somewhere you don't belong." I thought about a time I'd accidentally walked into the wrong board meeting at a different firm. I remember that prickle of embarrassment, that I shouldn't be here feeling in my gut. Jesus said, "Now imagine spending eternity in a place designed for the punishment of the most evil beings in existence." Humans aren't just in pain here, they are out of place. They are experiencing a level of horror that their souls weren't even built to endure. I looked back at the gate. I saw another neighbor, a woman who lived 2 floors down from me. I saw a man I'd seen at a coffee shop every Tuesday for a year. It wasn't a judgment in the way I'd imagined, like a judge in a courtroom. It felt more like a logical conclusion. If you aren't part of the network of light, where else can you go when the power to the world is cut? You just go to the only other place there is. The heat started to change. It wasn't just hot anymore. It was a fire that seemed to be fueled by memory. In the Gamma framework, we look at what we call relational continuity. If you design a piece of software to run on a specific operating system and you try to force it to run on a completely incompatible one, the program doesn't just fail. It glitches. It tears itself apart. Jesus is telling Yating that the human soul is incompatible with the environment of hell. Think of it like a fish out of water. The water wasn't meant to be mean to the fish by being absent. The fish was just designed for a different environment. When the fish is on the sand, every second is a struggle against a reality it wasn't built for. Basically, what that means is that the torment isn't just the fire or the sulfur, it's the fundamental wrongness of being there. I'm struck by her recognition of her coworker. This is where we see the data contradiction I mentioned earlier. If hell is total isolation, why would she see him? I suspect it's because memory is the only thing that isn't partitioned. In our world, if you lose your phone connection, you still have the contacts saved in the memory. You can look at their names, you can remember their faces, but you can't call them. In hell, those saved contacts become a source of pain. You remember the people you could have helped. You remember the people you could have shared the truth with. You remember the face of the guy in the cubicle next to you, and seeing him there makes your own torment twice as heavy. And then there's the common grace issue. Think of God's presence like a carrier wave for a radio station. In our life, even if we don't believe in Him, we still live inside that wave. We enjoy the smell of rain, the taste of food, the feeling of a breeze. That's what theologians call common grace. In hell, Yating is describing a network blackout, where that carrier wave is completely withdrawn. There is no good left, not even the good of a nice memory or a pleasant scent. All that's left is the raw, unbuffered signal of the other network. She remembered this part with such vivid detail, especially when Jesus spoke about the loneliness. We moved again, away from the gate and toward a place that felt even more isolated. It was the loneliness that started to get to me. I'm a person who likes being around people. I like the noise of the city. But here, even with millions of souls around us, it felt like I was the only person in the universe. Jesus referenced Luke 13:28. He said, "There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth when ye shall see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves thrust out." He showed me that the people in this place could see the joy and the peace of heaven. It was like they were looking through a thick glass window at a party they weren't invited to. They could see the light, they could see the love, but they were thrust out. The separation wasn't just a distance, it was a state of being. I looked at the souls around me. There was no kindness, there was no "we're in this together" feeling. It was pure hatred, pure despair. It was like everyone was a competing node for the same tiny bit of relief that would never come. I asked Jesus, "Is there really no way out? Is it really forever?" He looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see everything I'd ever done, every mistake I'd ever made. He said, "Hell is completely avoidable, Yating. Every single person who ends up here will have had multiple opportunities to accept me." He told me that God isn't willing that any should perish. He used that word perish. It sounded like a ship sinking in the middle of the ocean. He said, but he respects human free will, even when people choose their own destruction. I thought about my own life. I'd always thought I was choosing my career, choosing my apartment, choosing my path. But I realized I'd never actually made a choice about him. I just ignored it. I'd let the default settings of my life carry me along. I saw people in the pit crying out, "What if I'd gone to that church service? What if I'd listened when that friend talked to me?" Jesus explained that in hell, there are no second chances. He said the window of opportunity is only open while we're breathing. Once the heart stops, once that blue monitor light in my office faded, the choice is locked in. Then he told me something that terrified me even more. He said some people's punishment will be worse than others. He mentioned Luke 12, verse 47. He said those who knew God's will but didn't do it would be beaten with many stripes. I thought about all the people who grew up in church, who knew the Bible front to back, but who never actually let it change them. They're here, too. And for them, the memory fire burns even hotter because they know exactly what they threw away. The sound of the symphony of anguish flared up again. It was like a wave of noise crashing over us. I could hear millions of souls pleading for mercy that would never come, pleading for relief that didn't exist. And then the temperature spiked. Let me show you what I'm noticing here, because this is where the pattern becomes almost too clear to ignore. Yiting is describing what I call a system lock. Think of an old mechanical clock. As long as the gears are moving, you can adjust the time. You can move the hands back, you can wind it up, you can fix the rhythm. But if the mainspring snaps, the hands stop exactly where they are. They are locked in that moment forever. In the Gamma framework, death is the moment the system lock occurs. The relational state you are in, connected or disconnected, becomes your permanent status. I'm particularly struck by her mention of free will. As a researcher, I often struggle with how to map choice into a data set. But if we think of it as a network opt-in, it makes sense. You have to actively join the secure network. If you don't, you remain on the default, open network. The owner of the network respects your choice to stay unlinked, even if he knows that network is going to crash. And then there's the many stripes detail. This is an analytical bridge that I've heard in several other accounts. It suggests that the torment isn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It's proportional to the relational data you had in life. The more you knew, the more the memory of what you rejected haunts you. Basically, what that means is that the torment is a customized feedback loop. I'm sitting with Yating's description of the souls seeing heaven from hell. Imagine being in a dark, freezing forest, and you can see a warm cabin through the trees. You can see the fire in the hearth, you can see people laughing, you can see the food on the table, but the forest is surrounded by an invisible wall that you can never climb. The light doesn't warm you. It only reminds you of how cold you are. Listen to what happened next as the vision began to shift toward its final, most urgent message. The fire, it wasn't bound by physics. Jesus told me that the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth, some billions of degrees in a lab, is nothing compared to the fire of hell. He said it's a supernatural fire. It torments, but it never consumes. It burns, but it never destroys. It's like an engine that's running at red line forever, but the parts never melt. And the smell of the sulfur, it was getting thicker. I felt like I was being buried alive in it. Jesus said the lake of fire is the final destination. He told me that what I was seeing now, this pit, was just the beginning. In Revelation 20:14, he said death and hell would eventually be cast into the lake of fire. He called it the second death. I felt this overwhelming sense of lost opportunity. It was like I was looking at a ledger where all the numbers were in red, and the debt was so massive that 1,000,000,000 lifetimes couldn't pay it back. But then Jesus turned to me. He took my hand, or whatever I was in that place, and his expression changed. The sorrow was still there, but there was this intense, burning urgency. Yating, he said, right now, this very moment, people have the opportunity to avoid this. They can change their connection. He referenced Romans 10 verse 9. He said it's as simple as confessing with your mouth that he is Lord and believing in your heart that God raised him from the dead. I thought, simple? That sounds too easy for something this massive. But he said it requires a choice. They must confess me as Lord. Not just a good teacher, not just a distant architect, but the absolute ruler of their life. He looked directly into where my eyes should have been. Every heartbeat could be their last, Yating. Every breath could be their final one. And if they die without me, they will wake up in the place I've shown you, a place of outer darkness, unquenchable fire, and eternal torment. I felt the pull then. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was like a vacuum was starting to suck me back toward that ghostly blue light of my computer screen. He told me that people wouldn't believe me. He said they would call it a hallucination. They would say my brain was just shutting down. But you know what you've seen, he said. Tell them about the rich man. Tell them about the wide gate. Tell them that most people are on the broad road to destruction. He showed me one last thing before I left. It was a vision of people in churches, people who knew all the stories, people who did wonderful works, but who didn't actually know him. He quoted Matthew 7:23, I never knew you, depart from me. The network doesn't care about your works. It only cares if there is a genuine, authenticated connection. And then the void started to collapse. From everything I've learned listening to accounts, this simple choice is the most divisive part of the data. To some, it sounds too easy. To others, it sounds too narrow. But in the Gamma framework, an authentication is always a binary thing. Either you are logged into the network or you aren't. There is no mostly logged in. There is no I've heard of the network. Yating is describing the protocol of salvation as a direct, personal link. I'm struck by her mention of the red ledger. As a businesswoman, she understands debt. She understands what it means to be in the red with no way to pay it back. What she's seeing is that Jesus isn't just a guide. He's the one who clears the ledger. He's the bridge across that great gulf. Basically, what that means is that he is the only way to reestablish the connection that was lost. We're going to stop here. In the final part, Yating is going to describe the jarring transition back into her body in that Atlanta office and the relational shift that happened in her life in the 6 days since. She's going to tell us why she can't look at a computer screen the same way again, and the final message Jesus gave her as she was being sucked back into the world of heartbeats and deadlines. I want to pause for a moment here, because this is where the meaning reveals itself in its most practical and perhaps its most difficult form. We are closing the account of Yating, a woman who just 6 days ago was a deist focused on the measurable success of a corporate career in Atlanta. When I sat with the final minutes of her testimony, I realized I was looking at a phenomenon I call relational continuity. Basically, what that means is that the information she received in that network partition, the warnings, the faces of her coworkers, the absolute reality of the Great Gulf, didn't just stay in the vision. It followed her back across the line. It recoded the way she views every person she passes on the street. As a researcher, I have to hold a level of personal accountability here. I have spent years looking at these patterns, trying to remain an objective observer. But when you hear an account like Yating's, where the somatic reconnection, the return to the body, is so jarring and so urgent, it forces you to look at your own network. It makes you wonder if the connections we're building right now are meant to last. or if they're just temporary static. Listen to what happened next as she was pulled back into the world of heartbeats and deadlines. The suction was the worst part. It wasn't a gentle drifting back. It felt like I was being threaded through a needle. That ghostly blue light from my computer screen, the one that had been flickering at the edge of the dark, suddenly expanded until it was the only thing I could see. Jesus was still there, but his voice was getting quieter, like a radio station fading as you drive over a mountain. He told me to remember John 3:16. He said it was the greatest promise ever made. Tell them it is still true today, he said. I wanted to stay. Even with the sulfur and the heat and the pit, being near him felt like being home in a way I've never felt in my apartment or my office. But the network was pulling me back to my physical node. The last thing he said was, choose life, choose me. And then I hit. That's the only word for it. I didn't wake up. I slammed back into my ribs. The first thing I felt was the cold. My office is always kept at 68 degrees, but after the heat of that place, it felt like I'd been dropped into an ice bath. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. It sounded so loud, so mechanical, so fake. And then I heard a jingle, the sound of keys. It was the night janitor. He was standing over me, his face pale, his phone in his hand. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was full of that sulfur dust. I coughed, and the first thing I said was, "The gate? It's too wide." The janitor just looked at me like I was losing my mind. He told me the paramedics were coming. He said I'd been out for a long time. I looked up at my desk. My computer monitor was still on. That same blue light was reflecting off the glass of my empty coffee mug. I saw the spreadsheet, the same rows of numbers, the same quarterly projections. I started to cry, not because I was alive, but because the numbers looked so small. They looked like dust. 6 days have passed since then. I haven't gone back to work yet. My manager thinks I'm traumatized by the heart episode, and maybe I am. But it's not the collapse that haunts me. It's the people. I went to the grocery store yesterday, and I stood in the checkout line looking at the woman in front of me. She was just buying milk and bread. She looked tired, and I found myself wondering, which gate is she walking toward? Is she connected? Does she know the signal is about to cut? I've reached out to my parents. I've reached out to that coworker I saw at the gate. I haven't told him everything yet. How do you tell someone you saw them in a vision of hell? But I've started to talk to him. I'm trying to build a different kind of connection. Jesus told me that tomorrow is a gift that runs out. In Atlanta, we're always running. We're always looking at the next quarter, the next promotion, the next year. We live like the network is infinite. But I've seen the great gulf. I know that the partition is real. If you're hearing this, I don't care if you're a businesswoman like me or if you've never stepped foot in an office. I don't care if you think you're a deist or an atheist or just fine. I saw what happens to fine people who aren't plugged into the source. Don't wait for the blue light to fade. Make the choice now while the window is still open. Because once it closes, there isn't enough water in the world to cool your tongue. Let me show you what I'm noticing here as we sit with the aftermath of Yating's experience. In our research into somatic reconnection, we often find that the most accurate accounts are the ones that result in a radical shift in the narrator's social network. Yating didn't come back with a philosophy. She came back with an urgency. In the Gamma framework, we see this as a network update. Her entire system was overwritten by the data she received. The things she once valued, the spreadsheets, the projections, have been moved to the trash folder. The things she ignored, the spiritual health of her neighbors, have become the primary task. I'm struck by her mention of the janitor's keys. It's such a small, physical detail, the jingle of metal in a quiet office. It's the sound of the world reconnecting to her. But for Yating, the world she came back to feels more like a shadow than the one she left. I've been doing this work for a long time. I've mapped hundreds of accounts, but I'm still sitting with this. Why do some people see the light and the flowers, while a 29-year-old deist in Atlanta sees the pit and the sulfur? Is it because she needed a category violation to wake her up? Or is it because the network she was a part of was already so far into the outer darkness that she was just seeing the logical conclusion of her own path? I don't have a model for that yet. I'm genuinely asking you, our community, have you ever had a moment where you felt unplugged from everything good? Have you felt that symphony of anguish in your own life, even before death? We need more data on these relational shifts. If you've experienced a change in how you see your coworkers or your family after a brush with mortality, please share it. The pattern I'm tracking for our next account involves a doctor, someone who deals with the physical nodes of the body every day, and how he describes the moment the signal leaves the room. Until then, I'm holding Yating's words about tomorrow. It's a truth gathered through living, not just science. We assume the connection will always be there, but the data says otherwise. So here is the question I'm holding as I close my notes today. If we are all nodes in a massive interconnected network, what is the carrier wave that keeps us from falling into that isolation? Is it just being nice, or is it an active, authenticated link to something outside ourselves? Yating's account suggests that the link must be personal. It must be named. I'll be looking for that same detail in our next submission. We'll see if the protocol of salvation looks the same in a hospital as it did in that high-rise office. Thank you for being part of this research. We'll talk again soon.